Well, good evening. Nice to see you, and those of you who are joining us via Zoom. And very much looking forward to our session this evening as we continue in our study of the life and legacy of Francis Schaeffer, someone whose life and legacy should be common knowledge in our churches. But as you know, that's not at all the situation. Certainly, along with C.S. Lewis, one of the most influential Christian thinkers of the 20th century. But he's largely been forgotten or at least neglected, unlike C.S. Lewis. We'll talk about some of the factors that probably have led to that. But there is so much we can glean from his insights, his writings, and his ministry. So tonight we'll be covering chapter 3 in the book. Next week, moving right on to chapter 4. We'll go as far into 3 as possible this evening, given the time constraints. But without delay, we'll move on to chapter 4 next week, which is probably the most substantive chapter in the book. So it may take a couple of weeks to work through that. There's so much content in there. But let's begin on page 13 of your study guide. And this goes back to his ministry at L'Abri. There were just a couple more points I wanted to make about that before we move on into chapter 3. Now, last week we looked at the quote there at the top of the page by Mike Yaconelli. I don't know if you're familiar with that name or not, but for about 20 years or so, the Wittenberg Door was quite an influential publication in evangelical Christianity. I would say it was very influential for better and sometimes for worse. It was extremely critical of major trends in evangelicalism, both for the better and sometimes they would go off the rails. But Mike Yaconelli was somebody who truly deserved the title of being an iconoclast. But his publication there, the Wittenberg Door, certainly sparked a lot of thought. Didn't always agree with it. Sometimes he went, again, beyond the boundaries. But nonetheless, we need thoughtful critics, hopefully thoughtful, honest critics. And so you see there his comments about his interactions with Francis Schaeffer. And although Mike was generally, like I said, quite critical of leadership and evangelicalism in general, he was very much taken by Schaeffer's intellect and by the quality of his life. Now, the quote below that by Edith Schaeffer, she's also summarizing there in that quotation on page 13, the uniqueness of her husband's calling and ministry. She wrote a book in 1969 called L'Abri, and you see part of the quote there that I'm going to be referring to. And she basically is arguing there, Schaeffer had come under some criticism for not being a professional scholar, and sometimes writing on topics and themes beyond his area of expertise. That criticism is justified to some extent, but his critics oftentimes, again, went beyond, I think, where they should have. But Edith is responding to that idea that he is writing and discussing issues without being a professional historian, without being, for that matter, a professional theologian or a professional philosopher. And so, as you see there in the quote, rather than studying volumes in an ivory tower separated from life, and that's a valid point she's making, and rather than developing a theory separated from the thinking and struggling of real people in real life, Fran has been talking for 13 years now to men and women in the very midst of their struggles. He's talked to existentialists. You know, that was the popular secular philosophy of the day. He's talked to existentialists, logical positivists, those who basically hold to what we would call a strict view of scientism, and that is science is really the only reliable source of information and knowledge. Hindus, Buddhists, liberal Protestants, liberal Roman Catholics, Reformed Jews and atheistic Jews, Muslims, member of occult cults, and people of a wide variety of religions and philosophies, as well as atheists of various types. And she goes on to talk about, over the years, how many people have come to L'Abri, how many types of people he's interacted with. And she goes on to say, in it all, God has been giving him an education which is not possible for many people to have. Now, the answers have been given not out of academic research alone, but out of this area of live conversation. He answers real questions with carefully thought out answers, which are the real answers. This is what I mean when I say that God has given him an education in addition to unfolding a work in these past 13 years. So she's really making the case there, which I think we would all agree, and that is there's certainly a place for advanced education and for becoming a professional scholar, but there are many that have pursued other avenues of ministry, and their ministry is every bit as rich and substantive, sometimes far more than people in academia. Then the next point there, L'Abri, it was no monastery. Ben Mitchell later became a professor of bioethics and contemporary culture at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School. Ben Mitchell writes that L'Abri was not a monastery. It wasn't a place to go and retreat and hide out from the rest of the world, basically. It was an equipping center and a learning community with a goal of transforming individuals through engaging their whole person, their mind, their heart, and their passions, and then sending them out to transform culture. Now, the point is also made that L'Abri was not a cult. From the outset of its ministry, Schaeffer had absolutely no intention of trying to control other people's lives. People were free to come and go at will, and he often remarked that I will not be the Holy Spirit for anybody. And one other point, although Schaeffer was trained in the Reformed tradition, he was not a rigid five-point Calvinist. At L'Abri, by the way, specific creeds and specific confessions and styles of worship and denominational distinctives were not emphasized. And the atmosphere was casual, and but people of all Christian and non-Christian were free to come and interact. It's said that, and as you know, Schaeffer had a very unique appearance and dressed rather uniquely. But it's said that although the atmosphere there at L'Abri was very, very casual and open and so on, Schaeffer reportedly preached on Sunday mornings in a tuxedo, which is almost unfathomable to imagine that. Anyway, now the rest of that chapter in the book deals with the kind of, quote, radical finances that L'Abri employed, and we talked a little bit about that last week, how that Schaeffer took very, very seriously Paul's declaration in 1 Timothy 6:10, that the love of money is the root of all evil, and Jesus's warnings in Luke chapter 16 that you cannot serve God and mammon, or God and accumulated wealth. And so I think we did touch on that last week, and how this was a very spirit-led ministry. And Schaeffer in particular just wanted the group to come together on a regular basis, pray for their needs, but otherwise he was very much opposed to what he called a Madison Avenue sales mentality that relies on marketers, fundraisers, PR people, and coming up with clever ways to, quote, sell Jesus Christ and sell the ministry. So he believed that God could honor and answer their legitimate prayers and requests. And so rather than employing any kind of techniques that might be considered manipulative, let's just lay it all out before the Lord and pray that he provide for our needs. And that's exactly what happened over a period of many years. Yes, Bruce?
Those of you who know anything about me know that I kind of hang out in the science and faith borderlands. And one of the first books I read in that area was The Soul of Science with Nancy Piercy and Charles Saxon. We had the privilege of meeting Charles Saxon. He lived here in Atlanta a number of years ago through RTB and Areopagous.
Yeah.
It's still wonderful. It still holds up. It gets to the root of these issues and how we got where we were as far as this relationship between science and faith.
Yeah.
And how it's become such a critic of faith, where it's not at all. It suffers from the same issues as we do. I couldn't recommend it more highly.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think that book, which was written in the early 1990s, wasn't it, about 30 years ago, I think it still holds up quite well. The Soul of Science, Christian Faith and Natural Philosophy. You see that, and if you are reading along in the book, you know that one of the many who was so influenced by this L'Abri ministry was Rick Piercy and a girl that he met at L'Abri named Nancy. And they later, of course, were married and so on. And there on page 14 in the study guide, you see the books that Nancy Piercy is best known for. They are all absolutely excellent. So you got The Soul of Science, How Now Shall We Live, kind of a follow-up on Francis Schaeffer's How Should We Then Live, Total Truth, which is absolutely masterful, and Love Thy Body, which some of you have read far more than I have in terms of Christian responses to the sexual revolution. But of those that I have read, this is just absolutely excellent. So Nancy Piercy, again, I'm sure a familiar name to many of you. Now, before we move on into chapter 3, Comprehensive Christian Discipleship, which is what I'd like to focus on the rest of our session, I had asked Donna Weeks if she would go through the chapter and maybe just share a few thoughts that came to her in terms of what struck you as being particularly significant, important, and also, Donna, if you wouldn't mind coming up and sharing that, I'd appreciate it. You have enough room there?
Yeah. All right. Hello. So I had anticipated being at the end, so now I don't have to worry about repeating things that Jeffrey said. I can say them first. But anyway, yes, Jeffrey had asked that I kind of share my my takeaways or what I actually found very impactful. So here we go. I do want to say I'm a Schaeffer newbie. I quite frankly, a confession, I had not heard of Schaeffer until I was in your class, but this is the first I've read of him. And I have found him to be fascinating and inspiring. And the thought that has been with me since we started this series and in reading this chapter is that I wish we had a L'Abri. Would that not be amazing to have a facility like that where we could go and we could be around people to learn and think and act out beliefs, and it would just be an amazing thing. And Jeffrey has said in his classes that the ideas that Schaeffer had were revolutionary, that, you know, speaking about cultural things and just addressing those things directly, and not so much now. But quite frankly, I don't know. I don't find many people that address things out in the open anymore. You can't really say many things in public places if you don't agree with everyone. And I haven't heard much in church. So it would be great if we had more people that would step out in faith and speak the truth and tackle those controversial issues. So that was kind of my beginning summary of saying what I felt this series. It would just be so great to have that. But moving on. So in reading this, I think a good place to start, and what I think really to me summed up this chapter, was on page 54, where Jeffrey had written 1 Corinthians 3:19 and 2 Corinthians 10:3-5. And in these verses, we're saying, for the wisdom of this world is foolishness in God's sight. For though we live in the world, we have different values, we use different tactics, and we have a different agenda. And we rely upon a different power so as to demolish arguments and every pretension that sets itself up against the knowledge of God. And to me, that these verses and Schaeffer, it's a call to be a warrior. These are not soft, nice kumbaya words. These are, so many people picture Christians as being soft and sweet and passive. And I think so many Christians think that's what we're called to be. But I think that Schaeffer, and I think that these verses and so many in the New Testament and Christian fathers, they call us to be bold and to step out and to be those spiritual warriors in the world, standing on truth and love. And again, to kind of reiterate those words, you know, the wisdom of the world is foolish. My goodness, is it not more foolish than ever now than ever has been? I mean, a woman can be a man, men can have periods and babies, elementary school children can choose if they're a boy or a girl. Parents who go to school meetings are terrorists. I mean, the foolishness that's in our world right now is just amazing. And then the next part of the verse, it says, we rely upon a different power so as to demolish arguments and every pretension that sets itself up. Again, these are not the words of a pacifist. These are words, a general calling of soldiers to battle. We are soldiers in God's army. And that's what this chapter has kind of emphasized to me. It's been an inspirational call to action. But then again, so this chapter to me, again, a call to arms. And as we're looking through it and how on page 63, Schaeffer says our calling as a Christian, our calling as a Christian is to share this worldview of faith. That's about halfway down the page, and to do so in love. This requires that we be well-versed in apologetics so as to be prepared to effectively explain and defend why Jesus is the only way, the truth, and the life. So this is our calling again, but he also went on to say, well, let me go back up. As we hear these words and we hear this calling, how do we get from these strong words and how do we get from this calling that the New Testament has for us and the Christian fathers to where we are now? So I think this is addressed as well in this chapter. So on page 65, again, about maybe a third of the way through, Schaeffer says in his Christian manifesto, most fundamentally, our culture, society, government, and law are in the conditions they are in because the church has forsaken its duty to be the salt of the culture. And personally, I say we're no longer salt, we're sugar. We're empty calories with just sweet things to say. And I think we need to definitely embrace our saltiness. And he goes on to criticize on page 67, and something that Jeffrey has said frequently, he highlights that pietism that I think a lot of people embrace. I know I myself have. Pietism is the exclusive devotion to a private prayer, morality, family, and church in lieu of the more comprehensive understanding. So I think we can see that our calling to be in the world and to address these things, these are two things that Schaeffer has seen that has affected that. And something else that he had said on page 67 as well is kind of an anti-intellectualism where it became almost looked down upon to study too much or to talk about philosophy or to talk about the classic teachers, that you were it wasn't a good thing. So here we were saying I gotta remember where this one is. It says in all matters, it says, all right, robust Christianity requires both proclamation and persuasion. But even today, however, one hears it said that proclamation is all that matters, that to argue or persuade is to rely upon human philosophy, that to debate and confront intellectually is to overlook the power of the simple gospel, which is just so not true. To think and study and to know philosophy in no way undermines the simple gospel, but it builds our faith stronger. But all those things, I mean, these are the things I think that have led to us, not pursuing that truth, not speaking out in truth, not having the courage to address the issues. And what I feel this is really done for me in reading this and in studying Schaeffer is, my takeaway is a dire need for applied learning. Yes, the study of apologetics is essential, but what is also essential is learning to apply what we've learned. Jeffrey's classes have been so powerful in teaching a lot of apologetics and a lot of these things. And I think Schaeffer's that was his calling, was to gather people together to teach them and to not hide from the cultural things and not hide from the things going on in culture, but to know the movies and know the books and know the things that were going on and address them directly, and not to hide away in a monastery or ivory tower, but to be out in public. So I would love to answer this call to action because, in teaching the apologetics, that is step one. We want to deepen and strengthen our faith through apologetics, but that's not just for us. And it's actually not even primarily for us. We do that so we can share and defend our faith to others to the glory of God, so that we can be the salt. Schaeffer equipped people with knowledge and action. And I feel, that I've acquired enough knowledge, but honestly, I don't know how to deploy it so well. It's almost like a recruit. And you go in your basic training and you're taught, you read about a gun and you look at guns and they talk about it, but then you go out to the firing range and you learn how to fire that gun. Well, I kind of feel like I have the knowledge, but I haven't really been able to practice that. And I don't know about you guys, but we have close family members that sadly have really absorbed this transgender propaganda. And I work with people who are immersed in the current culture. And I want to be able to calmly, intelligently, and clearly engage with them. Not necessarily to win them over or to win an argument. I don't know if that's possible, but to do like we talked about, to plant that small seed of truth, but be able to speak that confidently and not have to struggle for the words or search for what it is I want to say, but to have that ready. And I feel like in order to do that, what I would love, however this would happen and however, is to have a small group. It's how I think that this could be put into action. It could just be 4 or 6 people, where you go old school debate, where you have half the people that do pro and half do con. You build up your strongest arguments on both sides, and then you actually meet together and you actually have a mock debate. And you have people talk to each other. And so that when we're out in the real world, because I've talked to people a little bit and, that they push back and they aren't just gonna roll over. And I just, that's the call to action I feel very strongly about. That's what I have taken away from this chapter in this class so far. That's it.
Any questions or anything for Donna?
I think it was great, as you said.
Thank you,
That's
Karen.
a great idea about that thing, understanding the debate style, because how are you gonna get that practice without doing that really?
Right,
hard?
right.
It's difficult, so I would be up for that.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah.
Just back to this issue of the modern church shying away from the intellectual tradition.
Yes,
I mean, who do they think gave us the intellectual capacity, to do this?
right.
And why should we put that in the back closet and shut the door? And Timothy Keller, the
Mm-hmm.
Presbyterian, pastor, remarkably says that we should face our doubts in their strongest possible armor,
Yeah.
right? Because that's where steel sharpens steel and iron sharpens iron, And we need to do that. We don't need to sort of wish them away or talk them away or what have you.
Right.
Because that will make us stronger and make us better at the things that we want to do.
Agreed.
So I think, and Schaeffer was extremely good at that, because he was willing to take on all people who came and talk to them.
Right.
We talk to them, my favorite word the last decade, ironically, tending toward peace, right?
Yeah.
In a peaceful way. And as Dennis Prager says from the Jewish tradition, I'm more interested in understanding than I am in agreement.
Mm.
I want to understand what your position is. Right? And that's the way we can get into conversations with people.
Yes.
How is it? Just as I don't believe in God. I could say, well, sit still and fasten your seatbelt. I'm going to give you 5 proofs of the existence of
Right.
God. I think that's going to do any good. Right? But if you said, what kind of God is it you don't believe in? Tell me about the God that you think is not, and just keep adding, that's.
Like that book Tactics, right? I
That's
talked about the
tactics, right?
questions.
That's-
Yes,
Okay,
yeah.
go right down the line.
Mhm.
It's so valuable. But eventually, all of those techniques reach a point where you have to have some knowledge,
Right.
right?
But also the techniques, like I was saying, need to be practiced. You've obviously practiced, so that's great, right? And so to
In my
be
head
able,
anyway.
but to be able to sit in front of a person who says, I don't believe in God, and to practice those questions and to have the rebuttals would be powerful.
And
That's
not be overtaken by the emotion of the issue.
that too, because yeah, I do get emotional on some of them, especially when they're political, and it's tough to stay calm.
And family.
Yes. Oh, my goodness. Yeah. Thanksgiving's coming up and we know what's around the table, right?
Looks like somebody has their hand.
Oh. How do we do this, Jeffrey?
Who is it?
Middle, lower.
Is it
right.
the pointer? Okay.
Capital letters.
Oh. No, okay, well, go ahead. Yes, sir.
Okay,
Yeah. Mhm.
one of the things that grabbed me in this chapter the heaviest was the defining of what a biblical worldview is. Now, we all know we have a Bible, okay? There's a lot, the worldview is in the Bible, but it is so well laid out in page 61 and 62, and 6 basic principles.
Mm.
And then all the add-ons to that, following a more specific and detailed set of criteria that follow it.
Oh,
Just, I mean, everything that you ever learn in the Bible begins to pop out there, and it begins to present a picture of exactly what a biblical worldview is. And then the other thing that grabbed me was Barna's polling of all the pastors and so forth, where they don't have a consistent, basic worldview of the Bible.
Right.
It's all across the board, so it would seem to me, the way to get this corrected, if it's possible to correct it, would be grassroots movement within denominations that were groups of people that are not laity, go to the leadership and say, hey, we want changes, just like we do in
Yeah.
politics.
Hmm.
Right.
Rather than setting up a separate school, a separate building or something for people to come in and talk. Why not go to the structure that exists and put pressure on the leadership?
That'd be good.
At least to some extent,
Yeah.
ministry should be demand driven, right? Yeah, should respond to the passionate needs.
I suspect here at Johnson's Ferry, the worldview is pretty consistent with what's here. But let's say it wasn't. It would be up to us to put pressure on the leadership to say, we need to change.
But there's great value, as we've implied, in distilling this biblical worldview down to a few understandable points.
Yeah.
This is analogous to the early creeds, isn't it? They were more theological. This is more philosophical.
Yeah, I'm
There's
finding
great
myself
bill-
going back to it and saying, now, what is a biblical worldview again? I go back to
Right.
review it, and I get a little smarter each time.
Well, it'll be on the final exam too. So,
There is one chat.
Oh, is there? I know you wanted to say something over here. Did you want to say something? No, change your mind. Okay. Let me see. I don't know how to do this though, Jeffrey. I'm sorry. On the chat.
Oh, he just took his hand.
That's the pointer.
He gave up.
That's the
Oh, okay. Oh, yeah, Janet says she could use a practice like that in a small group. That's a good idea. Yay, thank you.
yeah, Janet would certainly follow up
Yeah.
on that.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Yeah, we can share my
Yes, I
email.
would.
Okay.
Yes.
So I'll ask Jeffrey to share my email. You guys can email me. We'll see what we can set up if anyone's interested, but Bruce,
And,
yeah.
I'm
I
sorry.
could use- I could use practice because you guys, I'm in the work field and the most common thing, and it just happened again today, is when colleagues will tell me, oh, I can't go to church because they've had these horrible church experiences. And so that makes them question about God. I don't really know how to speak to them
Right,
other
and that-
than, yeah.
Yeah,
It's a hospital for sinners.
yeah, exactly. Right. Did you say Philip?
Philip, did you have a comment or question you wanted to share? Apparently not. Okay.
No, I'm not sure what happened.
Oh, you know what? On our screen, there's a hand. And sometimes sometimes it's right over yours or someone else's box. And we assume that that's you're raising your hand. So.
Not me.
Our apology.
First, did
Okay.
you want to say one
Well, I
more?
just want to say, gentleman over here, I'm sorry, I don't know your name, but,
Dale,
sorry,
Dale,
Dan. Further to this worldview issue, you know, those of you, I mean, some of you may know this, there's a young Chinese woman who comes to this class sometimes, who's been coming to our Sunday morning class, and Dave's not here today, but coming to our Sunday morning history class, and I have some background in China and Chinese history and philosophy and studied Chinese language and stuff, so I've ended up Pamela and I have ended up in kind of a discipling sort of situation with her. And I realized very quickly that there's a whole panoply of issues around this idea of worldview. What is a theistic worldview? What is a deistic worldview? What is a naturalistic worldview? What is an existentialist worldview? What is an Eastern pantheistic monism? What is an Islamic? And we've had a presentation that we created several years ago, and I got out that presentation. I showed her the thing, and it was astounding because it did two things. It answered questions for her, like what is the nature of ultimate reality and how do we know and how should you live your life and what happens after death and all these sort of questions, and contrast that against all these different worldviews. But it also raised more, if it answered 3 questions, it raised 25. But that's great, right? Because now she wants a copy of that. She's actually she's got a group of people up in Maryland where a teacher who she had when she was living in the States some years ago, teaches from. And she wants to translate it into Chinese and send it to them and have them talk about it. So I passed the presentation to him, you know, all sorts of stuff. But this worldview thing is so important. And I know exactly what you mean. I don't know how many times in my life I said, well, so what exactly does existentialism mean? Now I get it.
this is biblical worldview. This is
Right. I know, but that's
you have to count
that's one of the supermarket of worldview. I know that. It's like you're going down the worldview supermarket with your cart. And you're saying, you know, which one of these do I want to pick? You know, well, the one that most closely corresponds to reality and truth would be the one you want.
Can't you bring all of those worldviews that you mentioned that don't fit into the biblical worldview? Can't you just bring those under essentially the core of secular humanism?
No.
The problem is that people have an infinite number of combinations of, they believe the answer from worldview A for question 1 and the answer from worldview B for question 2 and, you know, so forth and so on. It's all a big hodgepodge.
That'd be syncretism, which is according to
And many of these are not secular.
Frank Mark.
I mean, they
The most
do
common worldview has
promote themselves as religions.
What is?
syncretism, where people pick and choose.
Yeah, secular humanism is actually a philosophy that derives from a worldview, and the worldview is naturalism, atheism, or materialism. Oftentimes naturalism and materialism there are differences in those concepts, but it's basically an atheistic worldview, a godless worldview. And from that come various philosophies like secular humanism. And then out of various philosophies come various ideologies like Marxism, for
That's
instance.
what I'm saying. Secular humanism is the basis for all of that. Basically, it's morality and self-fulfillment can be found without a belief in God. That's the basic.
Right, it's derived from a naturalistic worldview, right?
And Marx and everybody else
Mhm.
comes out of that.
Yes, yeah. Well, Donna, thank you very much. That was very informative. Thank you very much. And I was wondering, have you already copyrighted that idea that the church operates more like a source of sugar than salt? Because if you have not copyrighted that yet, I'm going to claim it, okay? And No, that's actually excellent. Did you come up with that?
I did. I
Yourself?
read it somewhere,
All right, well, that was divinely inspired. And it's so unfortunately accurate.
It is mad.
Yeah, we're called to be the sugar in society. No, we're not. No, we're not. And salt, you know, is a healing factor. We all know that. It's also an irritant, by the way. You rub salt into, you know, an open wound,
It cleanses
And
though as well.
it cleanses, but it also irritates.
Yeah.
Yes,
I was
Millie?
just gonna comment, it is, I know you know this, Jeffrey, but extremely difficult to get any kind of apologetics into the churches that I've been, mainly Mount Bethel. It's maddening, trying to, you know, you present something, you offer, and I don't know, they've been so distracted over there, that's been the excuse, but that is no longer the case. But-
Well, let's pray that it does become a priority, because I know that over the last 3 years, it's been all about disaffiliating with this very corrupt denomination, the United Methodist Church. So thank God that's behind them now.
But it's just amazing, you know, when you talk to people and just to engage, yeah. And, but that Barna study, I think that you mentioned, Dale, that our young people, you know, a worldview starts to be formed at 18 months and it's solidified by 14 years. So if we miss these young people. Now, when Caleb was here the other week, he said he thought it was a little bit later because he kind of went through a crisis in high school, but early on, our worldview is formed.
Well, we have a little 2.5-year-old granddaughter. I didn't realize she had a worldview
It
already.
starts to be formed.
We better get busy working on her.
Listen to a podcast where he Natasha Crane. And he said it's like an hour of him talking. And one of the things that he said was that's where the statistics show about formation of world. He's not saying you can't change your worldview. It's just harder, more difficult after you get to be 14 or 15 years old.
Yeah.
Maybe if you started that worldview by 14 or 15, when you have that crisis at 18 or 19, when you get to college, you have a stronger base to go back to.
Absolutely.
You have some sort of a crisis.
Absolutely. Well, again, thank you. That was an excellent review. And so let's hit some of the other major points in this chapter. On page 15 there, starting with a prophet for our time. Now, obviously, I think we all know that the word prophet is used in 2 senses in the Bible. Sometimes prophecy relates to speaking the truth of God to the present circumstance, which is how prophecy has usually been manifest and applied in history, including in our time. And that applies very much to Francis Schaeffer. Now, the other meaning, obviously, of prophecy is this divine revelation that allows one to predict the future. But not to confuse those two ideas. It's basically speaking forth God's word in your present time, in your present situation. And so Francis Schaeffer is certainly that. And throughout the years, he becomes a kind of a cultural watchman, a very perceptive, very astute social observer, and also a social critic. And if you're a very astute social observer, you would have to be a social critic as well. There's so much that's so obvious. And Donna mentioned, for instance, the sexual agenda that's being pushed in our time, which is not only immoral, it's just absolutely insane. And also it's even unscientific for that matter. Now, in 1973, Eternity Magazine did an article on Francis Schaeffer, and they noted in that article that Schaeffer is something of an evangelical phenomenon. he has more influence, they wrote, with today's youth from members of the counterculture to the disillusioned heirs of evangelicalism than any other one man. So this is 1973. As you know, he wrote and published his first couple of significant books in 1968. So this is only a few years after the masses of evangelicals were becoming familiar with him. Now, he's constantly emphasizing a prophetic theme, and that is that Western societies and culture have become, quote, post-Christian. Now, that's a term we use because it seems to resonate pretty well. Actually, it's not an accurate term at all, because no society, no culture, no civilization has ever been truly Christian. But some have been more influenced by Christianity than others. And I think the United States in particular has been very blessed by being very much influenced by biblical Christianity. But that term post-Christian, and I use it occasionally as well, but I frankly would like to retire that term. But anyway, Schaeffer used it, and he says Western societies and culture have become post-Christian, floundering in the muck of relativism and irrationality. And true Christians need to think and act as aliens and sojourners in a generally hostile world. And as you know, our society is becoming more and more hostile toward Christianity all the time. So that leads to, you know, the numerous New Testament scriptures that inform us and challenge us. Love not the world, and obviously it's not talking about the people of the world, but the world system. Romans 12:2, don't be conformed to the dominant worldview, the values and the priorities of this world, which are all about materialism, hedonism, power, status, success, money, entertainment, and above all, having fun. And of course, I mean, there's nothing wrong with having fun, but that truly can become the dominant driving force in many, many people's lives. And of course, Jesus, remember, is being interrogated by Pilate, and Jesus tells Pilate, my kingdom is not of this world. And then he warns, Jesus previously had warned his followers, if the world hates you, keep in mind that it hated me first. I've chosen you out of the world. This is why the world hates you. And by the way, if the world persecuted me, now he's still a ways away from actually being crucified, but it's approaching. If the world persecuted me, they'll also persecute you. And they do it in various ways. And, you know, it could be just be social ostracism, or it could be that you don't get the job promotion or the job opportunity that you're hoping for, because perhaps people disapprove of your Christian worldview. The Apostle James, don't you know that friendship with this world, in other words, friendship with the world system, is hatred toward God? When you just mindlessly accept the dominant values of this world, it's tantamount, according to James, to hatred toward God. And then the Apostle Paul, who says, though we live in this world, he goes on to say, we have different values, we use different tactics, we have a different agenda, and we rely upon a different power so as to demolish arguments and pretensions that set themselves up against the knowledge of God. The Apostle John, love not the world. Again, love not the world system, nor the things of this world, you know, the lust for power and status and position and so on. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. And so along those same lines, in his last book, actually, that he wrote in 1984, it was published just shortly before he died. It's called The Great Evangelical Disaster. I would highly recommend it. And I tell you, there's not a more relevant and appropriate book to our time right now than to read The Great Evangelical Disaster, because we are in the throes of a great evangelical disaster here in America. But anyway, in that book, Schaeffer warns against what he calls accommodation. Now, actually, what he's talking about here is what we would call enculturation. In other words, enculturation is absorbing and adopting the standards and the values of this fallen world. And it's so easy to do just that unless we're just constantly aware that this world is sick and perverted. Some societies are worse than others, obviously, but even ours is sick and perverted and getting worse all the time. As J.I. Packer, author of Knowing God, a great modern Christian classic, some of you probably read Knowing God, as J.I. Packer later recalled, Schaeffer's fiercest polemics were launched against professing Christians who had compromised the truth. So Schaeffer understands that's the problem in our society is Christians, or at least professing Christians, who have compromised the truth. They won't stand up in a principled, courageous way and confront the great evils of our time. Now, this idea not only is a rejection of so-called progressive Christianity, liberal theology, basically, but also insidious secular causes such as socialism and such as abortion, and later, of course, it would include the LGBTQ plus agenda. And Schaeffer urges Christians not only to resist these kind of perversions, but to infiltrate our culture so as to be a source of light and love and hope and truth. And this includes, of course, Christian involvement in education, in the media, the arts, and politics as well. And regarding this idea of cultural accommodation and enculturation, the greatest seduction, according to Schaeffer, is, of course, the perversion of authentic biblical Christianity. In other words, the greatest perversion and seduction is theological liberalism, which these days they prefer the term progressive Christianity. Theological liberalism perverts not only fundamental biblical doctrines, but also private and public moral standards. And I'm sure you know, if you were familiar with or involved in one of these progressive, so-called progressive churches, they are totally aligned with the radical left-wing secular humanistic agenda in our society. Rarely ever do they stand up to that agenda. As Schaeffer noted, theological liberalism is nothing more than just secular humanism dressed up in religious terminology. He goes on to say, liberals challenge the historical reliability of the Bible. Liberals also challenge the doctrinal and moral principles, especially the Bible's teaching on sexual morality. They also challenge the exclusive truth claims of Scripture, in particular, the exclusivity when it comes to Jesus Christ being the sole savior of humanity. They want to argue that, well, you know, some religions are better than others, but they all more or less coalesce. They all, you know, they're just winding alternative roads that lead to the same destination, but that's clearly unbiblical. Liberals make every attempt to sound, quote, Christian to the people in the pews in order to keep the money rolling in, so they can in turn build a church and a society upon a humanistic foundation. And he goes on to say, the liberal mainline churches today, the liberal mainline churches are far more destructive than any cults. Okay. Let's see now, for time's sake, let me take a look here and see what perhaps needs to be particularly emphasized. By the late 1970s, Schaeffer was concerned about encroaching liberal influences in evangelical churches. In the preface to the Great Evangelical Disaster, he writes, quote, "Finally, I would say that the statement which I am making in the pages of this book is perhaps the most important statement I've ever written. It concerns what I would call the Great Evangelical Disaster and the greatest problem we who are Christians face in our generation." Of course, he's writing that decades before many evangelical churches began embracing these trendy left-wing woke causes such as critical race theory and the LGBTQ agenda. One other thing that didn't come naturally and easily to Schaeffer, but what he really later realized was of utmost value is, now, as we've talked about before, he was converted and educated in a very strict Reformed Presbyterian tradition, and he continued to value that very much throughout his life, although he did depart from traditional Calvinism in some key respects. But nonetheless, he had a dim view of many alternative forms of Christianity, in particular, of course, Roman Catholicism. But as he grows older and wiser and realizes the incredible cultural evil that surrounds us and the forces that we have to contend with, he eventually adopts what he calls the principle of co-belligerency. And this is the idea of cooperating with others with whom we're not totally in harmony, but who share common concerns on important matters, such as in the case of co-belligerency with Roman Catholic Church. They are in the forefront of the pro-life movement. They always have been and still are today. And so despite denominational differences, theological differences, Schaeffer would highly recommend that we seek out coalitions of cooperation and cooperate with like-minded Christians on some of the most important issues of our day.
But I think, Jeffrey,
Yes.
that is the problem today. There's no real Christianity. I mean, there's no Christian voice, really. I mean, it's so.
You mean it has so diffused and yeah.
The Christians don't seem to speak together because most of the major denominations now split.
Mhm. Well, and this goes for not only denominations, but ministries, and that is everybody wants to do their own thing. There's very little attempt to cooperate and form alliances and that sort of thing. And so I think our efforts are so very, very fragmented. And Schaeffer would have found that just indefensible, frankly. And Donna, I guess it was you who brought up, or maybe it was someone else who brought up the issue that, maybe Millie, that why is Christian apologetics not absolutely mainstream in our churches? 20 years ago, when we started the Areopagus, I would have thought that by now, churches of any size would have on their staff a professional, I hate to use the word, but anyway, a minister of apologetics. It's so vitally important, but they haven't moved an inch. I guess there's perhaps a few examples, a few exceptions to that. But by and large, we haven't made any progress at all in church ministry in terms of incorporating Christian apologetics.
There is some, Jeffrey.
There is
There's a great
some.
interview with Alyssa Childers
Mhm.
and Jeremiah Johnson. He's out of North Texas. I'm going to put that interview on the next Watchman, but you'd be very encouraged to hear. I mean, he's teaching those kids. I think there's another pastor at his church. I don't know if he's the apologetic pastor or what, but
Mhm.
it was very encouraging
Good.
to hear him speak with. And of course, in the midst of all this, God has certainly raised up some excellent thinkers
Mhm.
over time. I just think of certainly the Colson Fellows, and the people involved there.
Mhm.
You know, the Breakpoint series, and then
Mhm.
Frank Turek, so many at Southern Evangelical
Mhm.
Seminary. So in the midst of all this, some very strong leaders have come forward.
Yeah,
There's no shortage of authors, or, or speakers.
no, there's not.
There's plenty of material to read and study.
Yeah, and there's just a wealth of apologetical
It's a lot
material.
better than it was
available.
years ago.
Since the early nineties, there's just been an absolute explosion.
Right.
And that's so vitally necessary and a lot to be thankful for, but it's really still not, infiltrating the church like it should. There are, thank God, exceptions, as you mentioned.
That's why I
Jeffrey?
hope that people don't really recognize Schaeffer now,
Mhm.
because Christianity never took up his word.
Yeah, well, and especially, why is it that a lot of churches do promote C.S. Lewis's writings, and rightly so, by the way, but they're very hesitant, or they just kind of ignore Schaeffer? Well, C.S. Lewis, as you know, was a masterful classical apologist, and that's so vitally important. Schaeffer's great contribution was cultural apologetics, and that takes us into areas that are very, very controversial. Takes us into politics, economics, social issues, moral issues, and so on. And as we were talking about, there's still such resistance in our churches and among church leaders. Jay, you had a comment, I believe.
Yeah, as you may know, that several years ago, with your corporation, we attempted to incorporate apologetics to the high school curriculum, but could not even move a needle just 1 inch. And I
This
gave a
was
lot.
at Perimeter Church.
Yes. And I
Okay.
thought a lot about why that is so. And one of the things that I thought about was that even the church thinks that apologetics is really not as an instrument or tool, but I think they consider it more as a threat to the status quo. And I don't know, it may sound almost like a heresy, but I don't know, that was one of the conclusions I got out of it.
Well, and I think when it comes to leaders in churches, they need to exercise some humility. They probably did not study apologetics in seminary, because very few seminaries offer apologetics. Just as most rarely ever study Christian history to any extent. But they need to understand that there are people, those fields, history and apologetics, are very, very important. They can do so much to edify the beliefs and educate Christians in the church. So whether or not a church leader is well-versed in apologetics or history or whatever, or philosophy, they need to understand and value the contributions that those fields can make to ministry. Otherwise, unfortunately, oftentimes ministry is kept on kind of an LCD level, a lowest common denominator level. And but for serious Christians, we need to encourage them, challenge them to go above and beyond where they currently are. I mean, that's what discipleship is all about. It's growing in our faith and going beyond where we currently are. So thank you, Jay. Yes, Bruce.
I think further to what Jay was saying, is that as we thought about this together and separately for years, but the churches are afraid that apologetics will raise doubts that they don't feel comfortable dealing with. And that could create divisions, and therefore, they just don't want to have anything that's going to stir the pot is not good. Right? keep everybody happy, everybody irate, keep the notion, the money coming in and run the programs and just don't ask these questions. But where, Tim Keller said, that I mentioned earlier, you need to face your day. He said, Keller says that a faith without doubt is like a body without antibodies. If you don't have antibodies, you can't detect a disease and you will not react appropriately to it and be able to challenge it and hopefully defeat it if it comes. If you don't have any, you're sitting dead in the water. So if you've never questioned these issues, you never thought about it, what your answers would be, if someone comes and presents one to them, you have no answer.
Yeah, the mentality in some churches seems to be at all cost, let's don't get into controversial issues. Well, everything important in life is controversial. So you get the impression sometimes that in a lot of churches, if you have doubts about your faith, just suppress them, okay? At least pretend that you believe all this, okay? That's better than raising complicated, challenging questions. But see, if the Christian faith is actually true, we have nothing to fear. Donna?
So let's look at the blind faith that seems to be promoted and going along the anti-intellectualism.
Yeah.
And that asking questions is a sign of doubt, not a sign of wanting to strengthen your faith, but it's a sign of weakness of your faith. It's just the opposite, like Rick was saying. We build our faith by asking questions. But mostly it seems to be, and that kind of that's looking down on intellectualism.
It's anti-intellectual, as you said.
Yeah.
And if you raise challenging issues, well, you need to see a psychologist. Well, of course, that's exactly the opposite of the track we should take.
I was just going to say that, I mean, it's been going on now for quite a number of decades in our society. We're totally on a path from sometime in, I don't know, 1959, I have no idea something like that, and being anti-analytical and being totally touchy-feely. And it's gotten more and more that way. Our music, our art, everything is about how you react.
That's a secular humanist technique.
Sorry?
The touchy-feely, the shift from logic to the touchy-feely is a secular humanist technique. They do that deliberately.
Well, right.
That's how they change that.
But there used to be a history of even people who were not necessarily Christians had serious thoughts about things once upon a time. And they lost it first. Christians may have held it a bit longer. And then everybody had to be just like everyone else, just emote with them.
Yeah.
And that's what you end up with.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and Donna brought this out as well. I mean, we're created in the image of God. God has endowed us with a rational mind if we'll use it. And we have nothing to fear from honest questions. And of course, as we talked about last week, that was sort of a motto of L'Abri. They were founded to provide honest answers to honest questions. So if Christianity is in fact the truth, we really don't have anything to fear. All right, well, let's go a little bit farther into the chapter. And let's see, I think this correlates to some of the quotes on page 16 in your study guide. Now, in 1965, Reverend O.J. Brown, not to be confused with the other O.J., actually Harold Okinga Brown, a very influential evangelical pastor at what in the past had been one of the most influential evangelical churches in America, and that's Park Street Church in Boston. It's right there in the inner city of Boston. Reverend Brown invited Francis Schaeffer to speak in various venues throughout the New England area. After that, Schaeffer was invited to go to Wheaton College out in the suburbs of Chicago and deliver several lectures. And you see there Schaeffer's lecture tour in 1965 on page 16. Michael Hamilton recalls that this small, intense man from the Swiss mountains delivered a message unlike anything I had ever heard in evangelical circles in the mid-1960s. What's so unique about Schaeffer? Well, he's actually relating the Christian faith to our contemporary society and culture. Imagine that. At Wheaton College, students were fighting to show films like Bambi and Herbie the Love Bug on campus. Those were banned on campus, okay? I think they should be banned just because they're really bad movies. But while Francis was talking about the films of Bergman and Fellini, whoa, this is high art, filmmaking art. Administrators were censoring existential themes out of student publications while Francis was discussing the works of Camus, Sartre, and Heidegger. He quoted Dylan Thomas. He knew the artwork of Salvador Dali. He listened to the music of the Beatles and John Cage. And people just couldn't believe that. What's this guy doing talking about John Cage and the Beatles and Salvador Dali in a Christian college? I mean, shouldn't we spurn all of that? I mean, that was the mentality. Jerram Bars writes that, and you see part of the quote there below the photo of Schaeffer, the fact that his voice was high and often would crack as he emphasized the point, the reality that no one could describe him as being charismatic or, quote, strikingly handsome in appearance, these things were completely unimportant. I would listen to him speak and be absolutely captivated by the truth from God's word that was being communicated with such clarity and power and with such relevance to our own moment in history and such immediate application to my own life. For my personal life, I would say that his humble dependence on the Lord, his deep awareness of his own inadequacies, in other words, his honesty, and the compassion that he demonstrated as he listened to people and answered them, those were the most important aspects of his ministry, his ministry and his example in being an imitator of Christ. Now, in a tribute to Schaeffer in an issue of the Southern Baptist Journal of Theology, Ben Mitchell, professor of bioethics and contemporary culture at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School, also commented on Schaeffer's appearance. Quote, "Now, I was well prepared for Schaeffer's survey of the history of Western thought. He had read, some of Schaeffer's works. What I was not prepared for was his appearance. Relatively short in stature, he sported a Billy Goat's beard, shoulder-length hair, and of all things, he wore knickers. Now, honestly, the only people in our society that should be allowed to wear knickers are baseball players. So I would kind of agree.
But in Switzerland, don't a lot of people wear knickers? That's pretty standard.
Yeah, I guess it is.
I guess Schaeffer, when he came to the United States, put on knickers.
Right. Forgot to bring some trousers. Okay. Similarly, in a 2007 article in Christianity Today entitled "Learning to Cry for the Culture," the singer-songwriter John Fisher noted that Schaeffer was, quote, hard to listen to. His voice grated. It was a high-pitched scream that, when mixed with his Eastern Pennsylvania accent, sounded something like Elmer Fudd on speed. Elmer Fudd on speed. As freshmen at Wheaton College, unfamiliar with the thought and works of modern man, so as freshmen, we thought it was funny. They thought Schaeffer was just really funny. But as seniors, 4 years later, after getting presumably a fairly quality education, it wasn't funny anymore. After we had studied Kant and Hegel and Sartre and Camus, his voice sounded more like an existential shriek. If Edvard Munch's The Scream, you've all seen the painting, The Scream. If The Scream had a voice, it would have sounded just like Francis Schaeffer. And another one who heard him on this lecture tour, Ronald Wells, later to become a history professor at Calvin College. Ronald Wells recalled, "We didn't so much listen as levitate."
Maharishi Yoga.
Yeah. And why? Well, because this guy's talking about things that you just don't talk about in church. You didn't even talk about these things in Christian colleges back then. You know, the works of Fellini and Bergman and all, it's just unthinkable. Christians had so divorced themselves from, you know, mainstream culture and popular culture. We need to be well-versed in popular culture to the extent that you can tolerate it, which is increasingly a challenge, because that's the level on which so many people think. And that's their primary source of entertainment. And sometimes it's their primary source of information. And so to the extent, again, that we can possibly tolerate it, we need to be as well-informed as possible when it comes to popular culture. Dave, let me go on a few minutes here more, and then I'd like for you to share what we had talked about last week. I'll go about 5 minutes, and then I'll turn it over to you. Well, the rest of this chapter, you see that Schaeffer writes a book. Let's see, where are we here? He writes a book in 1971, I think, called True Spirituality. Now here he gets into his theology, and it's a book primarily about Christian conversion. So he puts forth his views on justification and on sanctification. So, you know, in his seminary education, he did get a background in theology. He emphasizes, obviously, as you see there on page 17, the Lordship of Jesus Christ and the totality of life. We've talked quite a bit about that. And the issue that we were talking about earlier this evening, and that is, what about a Christian worldview? And what constitutes a Christian worldview? And he puts forth these 7 criteria. And I think if you look through that, there's absolutely nothing novel about it. It's all just straight out of Scripture. And like I said, is actually a wonderful distillation of what a real Christian worldview would incorporate. It's sort of like the Nicene Creed when it comes to just basic theology, for instance. And we talked about how that only a small percentage of professing Christians, people that if you were to ask them, are you a Christian? Some are, and others, it's more of a cultural tradition, and they're not Buddhists, and they're not Rastafarians. So yeah, I'm a Christian, yeah. But among professing Christians in America, surveys show that only about 9% or so hold to a consistent biblical worldview. Now, if you were to sharpen the question and not just say, are you a Christian, but ask them, are you a born again Christian? Well, that cuts the number of professing Christians way down, I don't know, maybe in half or more. And among people who call themselves born again Christians, in other words, they have had a conversion, a memorable conversion experience, only about 19%, less than 20%, hold to a consistent Christian worldview. And only about 37% of Christian pastors, barely half of pastors who serve in evangelical denominations, only about half. And this is really alarming. Among those who are involved in children's and youth ministries, only about 12%. And this comes out of pretty good research. It's research that's been going on for many, many years by the Barna Group, and it's a reputable, polling organization and so on. So lastly, my last point would be, and again, I highly recommend that you read the chapter because there's so much more in there that we can't talk about. On page 18, you see Pi, Doc, and Kite. And Schaeffer called Christians to an integrated view of discipleship that incorporates both orthodoxy, what we believe, and orthopraxy, how we live our lives. And his holistic approach to discipleship, he referred to as Pi, Doc, and Kite. That probably could use a little explanation. He liked pie. Okay. No. Pi, of course, is referring to piety, an emphasis on personal devotion, prayer, evangelism. We need to be attentive to family obligations and responsibilities and church involvement as well. Doc, well, that's doctrine. We need a solid doctrinal foundation. And then Kite, well, that's a reference to the Dutch statesman at the turn of the 20th century, Abraham Kuyper. Abraham Kuyper was a wonderful man and a great statesman in the Netherlands. He emphasized Christian social and cultural involvement in politics, in the arts, and in all other areas of culture. And so what Schaeffer's calling for is integrated discipleship. And as Donna mentioned, yes, piety, I mean, that's your commitment to a serious Christian discipleship. That's different, however, from pietism, which holds that that's all there is to the Christian life. Our Christian life and convictions apparently doesn't have much of anything to say about, the arts, about culture in general, of politics, and so on. So, and there's several more points I would have loved to have made. But last week, I was talking to Dave Cook and Debbie, and they related very, very interesting stories about their exposure to Schaeffer as they were growing up. And Dave, I think everyone would be very, very interested in what you have to share. So thank you.
Thank you, Jeffrey. Thanks for sharing the podium.
Absolutely.
You're very kind to do that. Yeah, Debbie is usually with me, but today is her annual trip up to the North Georgia mountains to tour some of the orchards, and so that's what she's doing. She thought she'd maybe be here in time, but she obviously didn't make it. I'm going to start on page 12 of the study guide. And this is how I got started talking to Jeffrey. Right at the bottom, 2 kinds of serious Christians sought refuge at L'Abri. And the first, refugees from liberal mainline Protestant churches. Debbie and I know one of those people. So this is honest and this is true. And this is the gentleman. His name is Jim Tozer, no relation to A.W. Tozer. But he was our pastor. When we first got married, I went to Purdue for graduate school, and we went to this church, Covenant Presbyterian Church in West Lafayette, Indiana, where Jim Tozer was the pastor. And in 1975, he wrote this book, How Not to Be Uptight in an Uptight World. Doesn't that sound like the 70s? But I'll just read a phrase or two here and there. This book is written to those who have remained in the church and are tired of the gray institutionalism, where the chief chore is just to keep the mint machinery running. That's straight out of Schaeffer. And the escape from the liberal mainline Protestant denominations, which is the church we went to is United Presbyterian. We talked last week about some of the nuances and the changes in the Presbyterian church. United Presbyterian was very liberal and becoming more so right at this time. But Jim Tozer, people in the congregation prayed and he became a spirit-filled Christian. And he knew he was short on some things, but he really became a strong believer and a vital Christian, which inspired his church. And Debbie and I actually grew as Christians, became Christians, and then grew as Christians by attending that church. Here's another phrase. The basis for personal hope is the confidence that we can know meaningful truth. Doesn't that sound like Schaeffer? We can know meaningful truth about ourselves and the world. One of the chief sources of inner distress today arises from our casual attitude towards truth. That's pretty accurate today, right?
Yeah.
So back in 1970, even though this title sounds very 1975-ish, it's irrelevant for today. And then I just have a phrase here. His spiritual journey and his spirit-filled, the thing that started that actually was a few years ago, so a few years before 75, when a group of 3 people began meeting on Wednesday evening to pray. The spark of renewal, which has brought new life to me and to our whole congregation, began in this group. Debbie and I know those 3 people. And it was really quite wonderful to hear their story about how they had prayed for Jim Tozer, and he became a spirit-filled pastor. You know, not every pastor is a spirit-filled believer. We just heard you mentioned the title of the statistics again, about how many pastors don't even believe in a biblical worldview. Well, here was one, but he transformed. And then the reason that we got turned on to Francis Schaeffer is because of Jim Tozer. And here's some words about L'Abri. In 1955, just when their work, Edith and Francis Schaeffer's work, was becoming established, their permit for residence was not renewed in Switzerland. They had 6 weeks to find and buy a house and to establish residence. And this is where the passage that Jeffrey, I think you mentioned a couple of weeks ago, Edith was inspired, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord. And so that's when they had peace about what was happening. Even though they had no funds and no possibility for getting a house, they trusted in a God who exists and listens to the prayers of his children, a God who can work in ways beyond anything we can ask or think. A few days before this deadline, this 6-week deadline, they were informed of an old chalet high in the Alps above Lausanne. What did God have for them to do in the remote village of Hermod? Their permit was renewed, but they had to have $7,000 for the down payment in 2 months. They have never solicited funds, which Jeffrey, you've mentioned a couple of times. They have relied upon prayer, trusting God to move those whom he wills to make his purpose possible. This is Jim Tozer writing about this. A matter of hours before the deadline, gifts from all over the world provided exactly for the payment. And today there's a complex of chalets and so forth and so on. And then Jim Tozer writes, it is one of the highest privileges of a lifetime for my wife Vivian and me and my 2 children to have spent 2 months at L'Abri. And they did this in, I think it was about 71 or 72. I'm not exactly sure that I remember. But we went there about the time this book was being published. We were at this church in 75 through 79 as I was getting my PhD at Purdue. A strong foundation in biblical truth was established for our lives. The incomparable claims of God's word have come home to our hearts, and we continue to see the instruction of his word daily. And that was Jim Tozer's inspiration. And then he talked a lot about Francis Schaeffer. As a matter of fact, in 1979 in West Lafayette, Jim hosted a portrayal of the movie How Then Should We Live, which was produced by Billy Zioli. I don't know if you know Billy Zioli, but he was actually came to West Lafayette, and he was there, and Jim Tozer was the host. And they showed the movie, and then there was a fairly significant, like an hour and a half long discussion afterwards, where Jim just took question after question after question. And it was really quite inspiring. And that's when we got to know more about Francis Schaeffer through that experience. Then I graduated from PhD, went to St. Louis for a couple of years, and we went to Covenant Reformed Presbyterian Church, which is the church that Francis Schaeffer and Edith left in 1948 to go to the mission field in Switzerland. So, and in St. Louis, he actually came to that church in 1980. We were there from late 79 through late 81. He came in 1980 and spoke about his views on abortion. And that's when we first got clued into the fact that, hey, as Christians, as believers, we should value life of all kinds. And it's, even back then, the society was throwing this culture stuff in our face and forcing it down our throats. And, we said no after listening to what was the next movie that he did?
Whatever happened to.
Whatever happened to the human race? Thank you. Whatever. And so he talked about that movie in St. Louis when it was just coming out. And that was very inspiring. And then one more piece of our story. We finished in St. Louis where I was doing a postdoc. Then I got my first job at the University of Wisconsin in Madison, Wisconsin, which some of you know is the bastion of political correctness. And it's just terrible. But I went there and was on the faculty. But it was a very interesting time because there was this dichotomy between what the university was trying to teach, and of course that's gone on and on today, and what people knew about the reality of faith. And Francis and Edith came to Madison, Wisconsin. It was about 1983. He was, I think, starting to talk about the great evangelical disaster, which I think you said was published in 84, shortly before his death. But he came to Madison, and we had a auditorium full of people. It was really quite inspiring. And that's how we got informed, and our experience with Francis and Edith Schaeffer, and how we became more convinced about the important things that he had to say, and also about issues like abortion. So thank you very much for listening.
Yeah, thank you.
What is your PhD in?
Analytical chemistry.
Okay.
And then I did a postdoc at WashU in St. Louis in clinical chemistry, and that's what I am today. I work at Grady. I'm on the faculty at Emory.
Was there any negative protests or anything when
Yes.
Schaeffer came to Wisconsin?
Oh, yes.
University of Wisconsin.
Madison, portrays itself as the bastion of this political correctness movement.
Mhm.
And so the people that feel that way feel like they have to speak up and protest on almost any front. But after the whatever happened to the human race and that exposure, and that solidified for Debbie and I our views against abortion, we started to picket abortion centers, and that also there was protest in there, and we experienced the strife of those two groups protesting.
Okay.
But yeah, outside the auditorium, there was maybe a dozen protesters. And of course, guess what gets covered on the news?
Yeah.
3 minutes on the protests and 30 seconds on Francis and Edith Schaeffer and their message and
Mhm.
so forth.
Yeah, I know back then, University of Wisconsin was in a ferocious competition with UC Berkeley to be the most left-wing
Yes.
campus
Exactly.
in the United States.
Matter of fact, the chancellor of Wisconsin at that time was Donna Shalala. Do you guys remember Donna Shalala? She ends up being the Secretary of Health and Human Services with Bill Clinton. But yeah, she actually was proud of the fact that the University of Wisconsin was the Midwest Berkeley.
Yeah, that's right, the Berkeley of the.
Yeah, she moved to Miami, Florida, became a congresswoman for a couple of terms. I think she's now retired. And I don't know what she's kind of fading away, thank goodness. But
We can certainly pray to that extent, yes.
Yes.
By the way, thank you very much. That's very, very interesting. Some of you may know that Ben Sass has announced that he's leaving the US Senate and has accepted the position, believe it or not, I know this sounds like pure fantasy, as the president of the University of Florida. Some of you are kind of nodding affirmatively. You've heard that. Pardon me?
And the kids are protesting.
Oh, and it is just sparking unbelievable outrage there at the University of Florida. So I think I'm safe in saying there would be nothing like him in any other university, major college in America. So I tell you, that would just take phenomenal courage on his part. So let's remember him in prayer. Perhaps he'll persevere and actually start in a few months, or perhaps all the outrage will deter him from serving in that capacity. But I mean, that's unfathomable, frankly. So much to pray about.
Problem, that's to get rid of the liberals.
Pardon me?
That's the way you get rid of the problem. Get rid of the liberals.
Yeah.
Replace them with somebody
Well,
else.
thank you. Great hearing from you all this evening. Thank you, Dave, and thank you, Donna, and the rest of you contributed to our session this evening. We may spend just a few minutes next week on a few more points related to chapter 3, but we'll go on into chapter 4 and spend the vast majority of time in chapter 4. I think you'll find it to be quite engaging and perhaps a challenging chapter. So blessings on the rest of your week, and looking forward to continuing our study. Thanks. Thank you all for joining us as well online. Always great to see you.
All right.
You're a great encouragement.
Thank you, Jeff.
Yeah, thank you.
Check the chat. Chat.
Yeah.
Check the chat.
Curious. I'm in the 19% who had a born again, this is Janet Herbo.
Yeah.
Who had a born again experience that radically changed my life, absolutely. And Janet has grown so much over the years, and is a very conscientious Christian, and she has a biblical worldview, which she tries to share at every opportunity. So, thank you, Janet. Good to see you.
Yeah. Nice to see you too. Thank you.
Okay,
Very good talks.
thanks. Have a great rest of the week.
Well,